It was 4:47 in the morning when Danny Carlisle's net caught something that wasn't fish. The weight felt wrong, too light for kelp, too deliberate for driftwood. He pulled harder, the winch groaning against the November cold, and when the net finally broke the surface, something metallic glinted under his headlamp. A silver chain, tangled around it, barnacles and time. Danny held it up to the light, watching water drip from the pendant, a small anchor with the initials RM etched into the back. His hands were shaking, and it wasn't from the cold. He'd lived in Port Haven his entire life. He knew exactly whose necklace this was. The fog was thick that morning, wrapping around his boat like a shroud, muffling the sound of the waves against the hull. His breath came out in white clouds. The radio crackled with weather reports and the voices of other fishermen farther out to sea. Danny stood there for a long time holding the necklace, feeling the weight of something much heavier than silver. What started on a clear September afternoon in 1979, when Rebecca Moreau walked down to the harbor with a smile and never came home, was finally rising from the depths. Port Haven, Maine, 1979, a fishing town carved into the granite coastline where the Atlantic met the pine forests, where fog rolled in every evening like a blanket pulled over secrets. The harbor was the heartbeat of everything. The docks where men gathered before dawn, smelling of coffee and cigarettes, their faces weathered by salt and wind. The cannery that employed half the town hummed with machinery from 6 in the morning until 6 at night, processing cod and haddock and whatever else the boats brought in. On Friday nights, the smell of fried fish drifted from the lobster shack, mixing with salt air and diesel fuel, and the faint sweetness of pine from the forests that pressed in close to the edge of town. The radio played the same 6 songs on rotation: Fleetwood Mac, the Eagles, Bob Seger. Everyone knew everyone's business, or thought they did. Secrets were currency in a town this small, traded over coffee at the general store, whispered in the church parking lot after Sunday service. Main Street had 3 blocks: the post office with its brass mailboxes and wanted posters yellowing in the window, the general store where Mrs. Patterson sold everything from motor oil to birthday cards, the church with its white steeple that could be seen from every angle of town, the cross at the top catching the morning sun like a promise. The lighthouse stood at the edge of the breakwater, its beams sweeping across the dark water every night, warning ships away from the rocks where at least a dozen vessels had gone down over the centuries. Port Haven was a place where generations stayed put, where sons followed fathers onto fishing boats, where daughters married local boys and raised children who would do the same. It was a place that believed in itself, in its routines, in the idea that if you worked hard and kept your head down and trusted your neighbors, life would be manageable, if not easy. Rebecca Moreau was 23 years old that September, with dark hair that fell past her shoulders in waves she never bothered to tame, and eyes the color of the sea on sunny days, blue-green and restless. She worked mornings at the Port Haven Register, typing up classifieds and obituaries, answering phones that rang constantly with complaints about delivery times and questions about subscription rates. She made coffee that was always too strong, brewed in a percolator that had been there since the newspaper started in 1952. She lived in a small apartment above the hardware store, a one-bedroom with slanted floors and windows that rattled when the wind came off the ocean. The apartment looked out over the docks, and she could see the boats coming and going, could watch the fishermen haul their catches onto the pier, could hear the gulls screaming and the winches creaking and the low moan of the foghorn on days when visibility dropped. She saved her paychecks in a tin box shaped like a lighthouse, the paint chipped and faded. She wanted to go to college, maybe study journalism, maybe move to Portland or even Boston. She talked about it constantly with her friend Margaret, who worked at the diner. "I'm getting out of here," Rebecca would say, stirring sugar into her coffee. "Not because I hate it, just because there's more than this." She believed that. She believed things would get better if you worked hard enough, if you were kind enough, if you simply refused to give up. She was stubborn and optimistic in equal measure, which made some people love her and others find her exhausting. She wore a silver anchor necklace every single day, a gift from her grandmother, who'd given it to her on her 16th birthday. "It keeps you grounded," her grandmother had said, fastening the clasp at the back of Rebecca's neck. "No matter how far you drift, you'll always know where home is." September 14th, 1979 was a Friday, warm for that time of year, the kind of day where summer was still hanging on by its fingernails. Rebecca woke up at 6:30, to the sound of seagulls and the distant clang of rigging against masts. She made instant coffee in her small kitchen, added milk from the carton in her refrigerator that was almost empty, ate toast with strawberry jam that she spread too thick. She got dressed in jeans and a blue cotton shirt, tied her hair back with a rubber band, slipped the anchor necklace over her head. It was the only jewelry she ever wore. She walked to work at 7:15, cutting through the alley behind the hardware store, past the dumpster where cats gathered, down Harbour Street, where the smell of low tide mixed with the exhaust from delivery trucks. The morning air was crisp with the first whisper of autumn, that shift in the light that happens in mid-September when you realize summer is over, whether you're ready or not. At the register, she unlocked the front door, turned on the lights, started the coffee. Her desk was by the window, cluttered with notepads and carbon paper, and an IBM Selectric typewriter that jammed if you typed too fast. She typed up an ad for a missing dog, a golden retriever named Buddy, last seen near the marina, and answered 3 phone calls about subscription renewals. Around 10:30, she helped old Mr. Peterson place an obituary for his brother, who died of a heart attack while hauling traps. She typed slowly, carefully, while Mr. Peterson sat across from her and cried quietly into a handkerchief. "He was a good man," Mr. Peterson kept saying. "A good man." Rebecca nodded, handed him tissues, made him a cup of coffee he didn't drink. At noon, she clocked out for lunch, walked to the general store, bought a tuna sandwich wrapped in wax paper and a Coke in a glass bottle. She ate on the bench outside, watching the boats come in with their morning catch, listening to the fishermen shout to each other in a language of nicknames and profanity. She waved to Hank Morrison, the harbour master, who stood in the window of the dock office filling out paperwork. He waved back, smiling that easy smile everyone in Port Haven knew. Hank was 46 years old, a widower whose wife had died of cancer 5 years earlier, leaving him alone in a house that was too big and too quiet. He'd been harbour master for 15 years, ran the docks with quiet efficiency, knew every boat and every fisherman by name. He kept the records, assigned the slips, collected the fees, settled disputes over whose trap line was whose. He coached Little League in the summer, the team that won the regional championship in '77. He brought groceries to elderly shut-ins when the roads iced over in winter, never asking for thanks or recognition. He sang in the church choir, a baritone that people said could have been professional if he'd ever left Port Haven. He was the kind of man people trusted instinctively, the kind of man you'd lend money to or ask to look after your house while you were gone. At 3:00, Rebecca clocked out for the day. She told her editor, a man named Frank Burrows who'd been running the paper since before Rebecca was born, that she was going down to the harbour to take some photographs. She'd been teaching herself photography for about 6 months, ever since she'd bought a used Nikon camera from a pawn shop in Rockland. She saved up for months to afford it. She was getting good too, had a real eye for composition, for light, for the way ordinary things could look extraordinary if you caught them at the right moment. She wanted to capture the boats at golden hour, when the late afternoon sun turned everything amber and forgiving, when the water looked like hammered copper, and the shadows stretched long across the docks. She slung her canvas bag over her shoulder, olive green military surplice with frayed straps, and checked that her camera was inside, wrapped in an old towel for protection. She touched the anchor necklace at her throat, a habit, making sure it was there. She walked down Harbour Street, past the bait shop where Jimmy Conlon was hosing down the sidewalk, past the cannery where the day shift was ending, and women in hairnets streamed out, lighting cigarettes, laughing about something. Several people saw her. Mrs. Donnelly, hanging laundry in her backyard, called out a greeting. Rebecca waved back. 2 teenage boys smoking behind the gas station, Bobby Mercer and his cousin, saw her walk past. They'd remember later because Bobby had made some crude comment and his cousin had told him to shut up. Hank Morrison, standing in the doorway of his dock office, watched her walk toward the breakwater, camera bag bouncing against her hip. She looked happy, purposeful, like someone with plans. She smiled at him. He smiled back, that easy, comfortable smile. That was the last confirmed sighting of Rebecca Moreau alive. When Rebecca didn't come home for dinner, her mother, Claire, assumed she'd gone to a friend's house. Margaret, probably, or Sarah from the library. It wasn't unusual for Rebecca to lose track of time, to get caught up in conversation or a book or her photography. Claire set aside a plate of meatloaf and mashed potatoes, covered it with aluminum foil, put it in the refrigerator. She watched television, the news, then a sitcom she didn't really pay attention to. By 10 Coons, she was starting to worry. By midnight, when Rebecca still hadn't come home and wasn't answering the phone at her apartment above the hardware store, Claire called the police. Sheriff Tom Carver took the call himself. He was 48 years old, had been sheriff of Hancock County for 12 years, knew every family in Port Haven by name. He drove to Claire's house, took down the information, tried to be reassuring. "She's 23, Claire. She's probably fine." Probably lost track of time. But even as he said it, he felt uneasy. Rebecca wasn't the kind of girl who disappeared without telling her mother. By dawn on September 15th, volunteers were gathering at the harbor. Fishermen who'd been out on the water came back early. Store owners closed their shops. High school kids cut class. Everyone who could walk combed the docks, the breakwater, the rocky shore that stretched north and south from Port Haven. They called her name until their voices were hoarse. They searched every alley, every boathouse, every stretch of beach where someone might have stumbled and fallen. They found her canvas bag near the edge of the water, caught on a piling, soaked through. The camera was still inside, undamaged, the film still in it. They found her car parked on Harbor Street, locked, keys missing. They did not find Rebecca. The Coast Guard sent a cutter and 2 smaller boats to search the harbor. They dragged the inlet with hooks and chains. They sent divers down into the cold, dark water, where visibility was maybe 6 feet on a good day. They found nothing, no body, no clothing, no sign of struggle, just the canvas bag and the silence of the ocean. Sheriff Carver organized search parties that covered every inch of coastline for 10 miles in each direction, every abandoned building, every section of woods between the harbor and the highway that led inland. Bloodhounds were brought in from Augusta. They picked up Rebecca's scent from the bag, followed it along the dock, and then lost it at the edge of the water, right where the bag had been found. Witnesses were interviewed. Everyone who'd seen Rebecca that day was questioned, their statements typed up and filed. Mrs. Donnelly, who'd waved to her, the teenage boys behind the gas station, Jimmy Conlon at the bait shop, the women leaving the cannery, Frank Burrows at the newspaper, and Hank Morrison, who'd been one of the last people to see her, who'd watched her walk toward the breakwater with her camera. Sheriff Carver sat across from Hank in the dock office, notebook open, pen ready. The office smelled like motor oil and paper, and the coffee that was always brewing. Charts of the harbor covered the walls. A radio crackled with marine traffic. "You saw Rebecca yesterday afternoon?" the sheriff asked. Hank nodded. "Around 3:30, I'd guess. Maybe a little later. She walked past the office, headed toward the breakwater. Had her camera with her." "Did you talk to her?" "No, just waved." She waved back. "I was busy with paperwork, boat registrations, fuel logs. End of the week, you know, always a lot to catch up on." "Did you see where she went?" "Not really. I was inside most of the afternoon. I saw her walk past, that's it." "What time did you leave the office?" "Around 5, I think. Maybe 5:15. Locked up, went home." "Alone?" "Yeah, alone." Hank's voice was steady, calm. He looked tired, the way everyone in town looked tired that morning, after a night of searching and worrying. "Did you see anything unusual? Anyone hanging around who shouldn't be?" "No, nothing, just a normal Friday. Boats coming in, guys cleaning their catches, the usual." Sheriff Carver wrote it all down. He believed Hank. Of course he believed him. Hank Morrison was a pillar of the community. The idea that he could be involved in Rebecca's disappearance was unthinkable, not because it was impossible. Carver had been a cop long enough to know that anyone was capable of anything, but because there was no reason to suspect him. He had no motive. He had no history of violence. He was just a man who'd waved to a girl walking past his office. Theories formed like storm clouds over Port Haven. Maybe Rebecca had slipped on the wet rocks at the edge of the breakwater and been pulled out by the current. The tide had been going out that afternoon, strong and fast. People drowned in these waters, even strong swimmers, even people who knew the ocean. It was a plausible explanation, one that let the town sleep at night. But Claire Moreau didn't believe it. Rebecca was careful. She knew the tides, knew the dangers. She wouldn't have been careless. Another theory, maybe she'd run away. Small-town girl with big city dreams finally deciding to leave without looking back. People did that sometimes, especially young people who felt trapped. But Rebecca's car was still in Port Haven. Her savings, 1,847 in the lighthouse tin, were still in her apartment. Her clothes, her books, her photographs, Everything that mattered to her was still there. If she'd run away, she'd done it with nothing but the clothes on her back. A third theory, the one nobody wanted to say out loud. Someone had taken her, a stranger passing through, a drifter, a boat that had stopped in Port Haven for fuel and left before morning. But Port Haven wasn't on the way to anywhere. It was the end of the road, literally. Route 1 stopped a few miles north and turned into a logging road. You had to want to be in Port Haven to end up there. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Rebecca's face appeared on flyers that were stapled to telephone poles, taped to the windows of the general store, pinned to the bulletin board at the post office. Missing. Rebecca Ann Moreau, 23 years old. Last seen September 14th, 1979. The photograph showed her smiling, the anchor necklace visible at her throat. The Port Haven Register ran front-page stories. The television stations out of Bangor sent crews to film segments about the missing girl from the fishing town. Tips came in, most of them useless. Someone thought they'd seen her hitchhiking near Augusta. Someone else swore they'd spotted her getting on a bus to Boston. None of it led anywhere. Sheriff Carver followed every lead personally, drove hundreds of miles chasing ghosts and shadows. He wanted to find her. He wanted to bring her home, even if it was just her body, even if it was just so Claire could bury her daughter and have a place to grieve. But the ocean kept its secrets. Claire Moreau aged a decade in a single season. The lines around her eyes deepened. Her hair, which had been dark like Rebecca's, turned grey almost overnight. She stopped singing in the church choir. She stopped going to the dinners and the socials and the events that had once made up her life. She sat in Rebecca's apartment above the hardware store and waited for the phone to ring, for the door to open, for her daughter to walk back into the world. She kept Rebecca's things exactly as they'd been that last morning. The coffee cup in the sink, the bed unmade, the Nikon camera on the kitchen table where the police had returned it after developing the film. The photographs showed the harbour at different times of day, boats and gulls and the play of light on water. The last frame on the roll was a shot of Hank Morrison's dock office, taken from the breakwater, the window visible, a figure inside blurred by the reflection of sky on glass. The town held vigils. The church was full of candles and silence and guilt, because that's what happens in small towns when someone vanishes. The guilt spreads like oil on water, touching everyone, staining everything. Could we have done more? Should we have seen something? Were there signs we missed? People started locking their doors for the first time in memory. Parents stopped letting their children walk alone after dark. The harbour, once the centre of community life, became a place of unease. Fishermen still went out before dawn, still hauled their traps and mended their nets and brought their catches to the cannery, but they didn't linger at the docks anymore. They didn't gather at the lobster shack on Friday nights the way they used to. They didn't joke with Hank Morrison the way they had before. Not because they suspected him, just because everything felt wrong now. The shape of daily life had shifted, and nobody knew how to shift it back. By the winter of 1980, the case had gone cold. Sheriff Carver kept the file open, kept Rebecca's photograph on his desk next to the picture of his own daughter, but there were no leads, no evidence, no body. The Coast Guard had stopped searching. The volunteers had returned to their normal lives. The television crews had moved on to other stories. The official theory became drowning, accidental or otherwise, tragic but plausible. The ocean took people sometimes, swallowed them whole and never gave them back. It was a truth the town had lived with for generations, scratched into gravestones in the cemetery, written in the logbooks of lost vessels. Claire Moreau refused to believe it. She wrote letters to the governor, to the state police, to the FBI. She hired a private investigator from Portland who took her money and found nothing. She put up new flyers every few months, replacing the ones that had faded in the sun or been torn down by wind. Have you seen my daughter? But hope is not a renewable resource, and eventually even Claire's ran dry. The years accumulated like driftwood on the shore. 1981, 1985, 1990. The lighthouse was automated, the keeper's position eliminated. The building turned into a museum that opened 3 months a year for tourists. The cannery closed in 1987, unable to compete with factory ships and changing regulations. Half the town lost their jobs. Young people left for college and didn't come back, or joined the military, or moved to Portland and Bangor and Boston in search of work that didn't exist in Port Haven anymore. The docks fell into disrepair. Boats rotted at their moorings. The lobster shack changed owners twice, then closed for good. Main Street slowly emptied. The general store became a gift shop. The post office cut its hours. The church congregation dwindled to a handful of elderly parishioners who sang hymns in voices that wavered and cracked. Hank Morrison retired in 1995, handed over the harbour master duties to his assistant, a younger man named Paul Vickers who'd grown up in Port Haven and never left. Hank moved into a small house at the edge of town, a 2-bedroom ranch with vinyl siding and a chain-link fence. He was 63 years old, his hair white, his face lined but still recognizable as the man he'd been. He kept to himself mostly, didn't socialize much, occasionally helped out at the docks when they were short-handed or when a complicated situation required someone with his experience. He was quiet, pleasant when spoken to, the kind of elderly man you'd see buying groceries at the supermarket or sitting on a bench outside the hardware store on sunny afternoons. People who'd known him for decades still waved when they drove past, still stopped to chat about the weather or the fishing or how much the town had changed. He was part of Port Haven's history, a fixture, a reminder of a time when things were simpler, even if they weren't better. Claire Moreau died in 2003, 24 years after her daughter disappeared. She died of a heart attack in her sleep, alone in the house she'd lived in her entire married life. At the funeral, the minister talked about faith and loss and the mystery of God's plan. He did not mention that Claire had spent nearly a quarter-century waiting for an answer that never came, that she'd died not knowing whether her daughter had drowned or run away or been murdered, that the last thing she'd said before the stroke that preceded the heart attack was Rebecca's name. She was buried next to her husband in the town cemetery, beneath a granite headstone that listed her name and her dates, and nothing else. Sheriff Tom Carver attended the funeral. He was retired by then, 71 years old, his hands shaking from Parkinson's, but he came because he owed it to Claire and to Rebecca. He stood at the graveside and felt the weight of failure pressing down on him like the Maine winter. He'd never found her. He'd never brought her home. Carver retired in 2006. The Rebecca Moreau case still a weight on his conscience, still the one that got away. The file sat in a storage room at the police station in a cardboard box alongside dozens of other unsolved cases. Missing persons and suspicious deaths and crimes that had no resolution because the evidence was lost or the witnesses were dead, or the technology of the time simply wasn't good enough. New sheriffs came and went. The box stayed in the storage room, gathering dust. Occasionally, a young deputy would pull it out, read through the witness statements and the search reports and the coroner's preliminary findings, drowning, cause of death unknown, no body recovered, and then put it back. What else was there to do? The case was 40 years old. Everyone involved was dead or retired. The ocean had taken Rebecca Moreau, and the ocean wasn't giving her back. Port Haven changed. Not quickly, not dramatically, but in the slow accretion of decades. The harbour was renovated in the early 2000s with state money and federal grants. The docks rebuilt, new slips added, a marina for pleasure boats. Tourism became the economy's lifeblood. Summer people from Boston and New York who bought the old fishermen's cottages and turned them into vacation homes, who came for a week or a month and spent money at the restaurants and the gift shops and the kayak rental place. New money brought new businesses. A craft brewery opened where the cannery used to be. The Lobster Shack was bought by a couple from Portland and reopened as a farm-to-table restaurant with a menu that would have been incomprehensible to the fishermen who'd eaten there in 1979. The general store became an art gallery. The church, with its dwindling congregation, rented out its basement to a yoga studio. The old-timers, the ones who remembered Port Haven before the tourists, before the renovations, before Rebecca Moreau, gathered at the one remaining diner, a place called Mavis's that served breakfast all day and refused to change its menu or its decor. They sat in the same booths they'd sat in for 50 years and talked about the way things used to be, back when everyone knew everyone, back when the biggest news was the size of the catch or who'd gotten drunk at the Lobster Shack on Saturday night. And sometimes, late at night, when the fog rolled in and the lighthouse beam swept across the dark water, they talked about Rebecca Moreau. Not often, because the memory was painful and the guilt was still there, but sometimes. The girl who walked down to the harbour and never came back. The mystery that Port Haven carried in its bones, that shaped the town in ways nobody talked about but everyone felt. Danny Carlisle was 38 years old in November 2025, the son of a fisherman, the grandson of a fisherman, pulling lobster traps off the same coastline his family had worked for 4 generations. He'd heard the story of Rebecca Moreau his entire life. Every kid in Port Haven had. It was part of the town's mythology, like the ghost stories about drowned sailors and the legend of the sea captain who'd put a curse on the harbor before his ship went down in 1843. Danny had never given Rebecca's disappearance much thought. It was just something that had happened before he was born, a sad story that belonged to another era, like the cannery closing or the lighthouse being automated. Port Haven was full of sad stories. You lived with them. Until November 8, 2025, when his net pulled up a silver necklace from the ocean floor, and everything shifted. Danny had been out since 4 o'clock that morning, working his traps in the deep water off the breakwater, the same water his father and grandfather had fished. The sun hadn't risen yet. The fog was thick enough that he was navigating by GPS and the glow of his instruments. When the net came up and he saw the glint of metal, his first thought was that he'd snagged someone's lost jewelry. People were always dropping things off the docks, rings and bracelets and watches. He untangled the necklace from the net, wiped away the barnacles and silt, held it up to his headlamp. A small silver anchor, initials on the back, RM. And suddenly, with a clarity that felt like cold water poured down his back, he knew. He'd seen the photograph on the wall at the lobster shack, back before it closed and reopened as something else. A memorial the owner had put up in the early 80s, a black and white picture of Rebecca Moreau smiling, the anchor necklace visible at her throat. He'd walked past that photograph 100 times, 1,000 times, barely registering it. But now, standing on the deck of his boat in the pre-dawn darkness, the necklace dripping seawater onto his gloves, he felt the weight of 46 years pressing down on him. She'd been here all along, right here, in the water he worked every day, in the depths he pulled his traps from. How many times had his boat passed over her? How many times had other boats, other fishermen, drifted above her resting place without knowing? Danny radioed the Coast Guard. His voice was shaking. He gave them his coordinates, explained what he'd found. Within an hour, Port Haven's small police station, a brick building on Main Street with 2 holding cells and a staff of 5, was buzzing with activity for the first time in a decade. The current sheriff, a woman named Linda Torres who'd moved to Port Haven from Boston 5 years earlier, called the Maine State Police. The necklace was logged as evidence, photographed from every angle, placed in a sealed bag. Coordinates were recorded with GPS precision. A dive team was dispatched from Augusta, and on November 10, 2025, 46 years and 57 days after Rebecca Moreau walked down to the harbor, they found her. She was 30 feet down, tangled in old fishing net that had been there so long it was more rust than rope. The current had shifted her over the decades, but not far. She'd been weighted down with chains and a piece of ballast, hidden deliberately, methodically. The divers brought her up carefully, reverently. What remained was bones and scraps of clothing, denim and cotton that had somehow survived, and the calcium deposits that time and salt water had left behind. The forensic analysis was conclusive. Blunt force trauma to the skull, visible even after 46 years. Evidence of strangulation, the hyoid bone fractured in a way consistent with manual compression. Signs of struggle, defensive fractures in the small bones of her hands. This was not an accident. This was not a drowning. This was murder, deliberate and violent. And the location, combined with the witness statements from 1979, pointed to one inescapable conclusion. The last person confirmed to have seen Rebecca Moreau alive was Hank Morrison, the man whose office overlooked the exact stretch of dock where her bag was found, the man who had access to boats, to nets, to the chains and ballast used to weight her body, the man who knew the currents and tides well enough to know exactly where to put her so she'd stay hidden, the man everyone had trusted. Modern forensic techniques can extract DNA from evidence decades old, from bone fragments, from the residue of violence preserved in calcium and silt. The Maine State Police Major Crimes Unit reopened the case with resources Sheriff Carver never had: genetic genealogy, digital reconstruction, forensic anthropology, mass spectrometry. They worked methodically, carefully, knowing there would be no second chance. DNA was extracted from beneath Rebecca's fingernails, where it had been preserved by the cold water and the protective layers of sediment, skin cells, microscopic traces of her killer. The sample was run through every database available, Codis, GetMatch, commercial genealogy sites, no direct match, but there were familial connections, distant relatives that pointed to specific family lines in Port Haven and the surrounding towns. The investigation narrowed. On November 15, 2025, detectives obtained a search warrant for Hank Morrison's home. They did it quietly, carefully at 6 in the morning when they knew he'd be home, when there'd be no chance of flight or confrontation. They collected DNA samples from his toothbrush, his razor, his hairbrush. They photographed everything. They took his computer, his papers, boxes of documents from the closet. And when the lab results came back 3 days later, there was a match. Not circumstantial, not speculative, definitive. The DNA beneath Rebecca Moreau's fingernails belonged to Hank Morrison. On November 18, 2025, at 6 in the morning, 2 Maine State Police detectives knocked on the door of a small ranch house at the edge of Port Haven. Hank Morrison answered in his bathrobe, coffee mug in hand, the morning news playing on a television in the background. He looked older than 73, his face carved with lines deep enough to hold shadows, his hands spotted with age, but steady. He knew why they were there. You could see it in his eyes. Not surprise, not confusion, just a kind of weary recognition. "Mr. Morrison," one detective said, showing her badge, "we need you to come with us." He didn't ask why. He didn't protest. He set down his coffee mug on the small table by the door, turned off the television, and held out his wrists for the handcuffs. As if he'd been waiting 46 years for this moment to arrive. As if, on some level, he'd always known the ocean would give her back. The arrest sent shockwaves through Port Haven, not because people couldn't believe Hank Morrison was capable of murder. Human beings are capable of terrible things, and small towns know this better than anyone. But because he'd lived among them for nearly 5 decades after killing Rebecca Moreau. He'd coached their children, he'd attended their churches, he'd drunk coffee at their diners and waved from his porch and helped jumpstart their cars in winter. He'd pretended to be one of them and they'd believed him. The betrayal was existential. It shattered the foundational myth of Port Haven, that it was a place where you knew your neighbors, where safety was assumed, where evil was something that happened elsewhere, in cities, in places where people were strangers to each other. Now they understood that evil had been sitting beside them the entire time, smiling, waving, blending in perfectly. The details emerged slowly, painfully, through court documents and leaked police reports and the kind of whispered conversations that happen in diners and parking lots. Hank Morrison confessed after 3 hours of questioning. Not out of remorse. He was long past that, if he'd ever felt it at all. Out of exhaustion, maybe, or inevitability. He said Rebecca had come to the dock office that afternoon in September 1979, around 3:45. She'd asked to use the restroom. They'd talked briefly about her photography, about the boats, about nothing in particular. Then she'd mentioned something she'd seen the week before, a boat leaving the harbor late at night without running lights, unregistered, unfamiliar. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, just something odd, but she'd taken a photograph of it just in case. She wanted to know if Hank, as harbor master, might know what it was about. The boat, it turned out, had been part of a smuggling operation, marijuana and cocaine moving up the coast from Boston to Canada, a small but profitable side business that Hank Morrison had been facilitating since 1976. Extra income, easy money. He took a cut for looking the other way, for making sure the boats weren't recorded in the log, for keeping the dock lights off on certain nights. Nobody would ever suspect the harbor master. And nobody had, until a 23-year-old girl with a camera asked the wrong question. He couldn't let her develop that film, couldn't let her show it to anyone, couldn't risk everything he'd built. So he'd killed her. Quickly, quietly, with the kind of brutal efficiency that comes from panic and self-preservation. He'd hit her with a wrench from the tool cabinet in the office. When she fell, he'd strangled her to make sure. Then he'd waited until dark, well after midnight, loaded her body onto one of the small workboats, motored out beyond the breakwater, weighted her down with chains he kept for mooring repairs, and dropped her into the ocean. He went home. He showered. He ate a sandwich. He watched Johnny Carson. He went to bed. And the next morning, when Sheriff Carver came to question him, he lied without hesitation and helped coordinate the search for the girl he'd murdered hours earlier. For 46 years, he lived with it. He woke up every morning, made his coffee, went to work, came home, watched television, went to sleep. He attended Rebecca's memorial service. He stood in the back of the church while Claire Moreau sobbed in the front pew, and he sang the hymns and bowed his head during the prayers. He watched Claire age and break and die without ever knowing what happened to her daughter. And according to his confession, according to the detectives who sat across from him in the interrogation room and listened to him speak in that same calm, pleasant voice everyone in Port Haven knew, he slept fine most nights. "It was a long time ago," he said. "I'm a different person now." As if 46 years of pretending made the murder less real, as if time could erase what he'd done. The trial was scheduled for March 2026, but it never made it that far. Hank Morrison's defense attorney, a public defender from Augusta, who looked exhausted before the case even started, advised him to plead guilty. The evidence was overwhelming. The DNA was conclusive. The confession was recorded, witnessed, legally obtained. There was no defense except to argue for mercy, and mercy was in short supply. On January 15, 2026, in a courtroom packed with Port Haven residents and journalists from as far away as Boston and New York, Hank Morrison entered a guilty plea to murder in the first degree. The judge, a woman in her 60s who'd presided over hundreds of cases in her career, looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "You took a young woman's life," she said. "You took her future. You took her mother's hope. And then you lived among the people who trusted you, who grieved with you, who never suspected that the man they waved to every morning was a killer. The cruelty of that, the sustained, deliberate cruelty of it, is beyond comprehension." She sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Hank Morrison showed no reaction. He was 73 years old. He would die in prison, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. He's currently incarcerated at the Maine State Prison in Warren, a maximum security facility about an hour south of Port Haven. He spends most of his time in the library, reading books about the ocean, maritime history, accounts of shipwrecks, memoirs of fishermen and sailors. He receives no visitors. He writes no letters. The other inmates know who he is, what he did. They leave him alone, not out of respect, but out of a kind of disgusted indifference. He's just another old man waiting to die, carrying his secrets to whatever comes next. Port Haven held a memorial service for Rebecca Moreau on December 18, 2025, 46 years and 3 months after she disappeared. The church was full for the first time in a decade, standing room only, people crowding into the aisles and the vestibule, spilling out onto the front steps. Flowers covered the altar, donations from people who'd never met Rebecca, but who'd been moved by her story, by the injustice of it, by the decades of waiting. Sheriff Linda Torres spoke about the investigation, about the fisherman who'd found the necklace, about the forensic work that had finally brought answers. The minister, a young man who'd only been in Port Haven for 3 years, read from Ecclesiastes. "To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under the heaven. A time to be born and a time to die, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance." His voice cracked on the last line. Nobody laughed. Nobody danced. This was only a time for mourning. Danny Carlisle stood in the back of the church, uncomfortable in a suit he'd borrowed from his brother, holding the silver anchor necklace in his pocket. The police had returned it to him after the trial, though he didn't know why they'd given it to him instead of keeping it as evidence. Maybe because he'd found it. Maybe because Rebecca had no living family left to claim it. He turned it over and over in his fingers, feeling the weight of it, the cold metal that had spent 46 years in the ocean and come back changed but intact. He thought about his father, who'd died of lung cancer in 2019, who'd fished these waters his entire life and never known what lay beneath them. He thought about his grandfather, who used to tell stories about the boats that went down and the men who were lost, who believed the ocean was a living thing with moods and intentions. He wondered what his grandfather would have said about Rebecca Moreau. Probably something about the ocean keeping what it wanted and giving back what it was done with. Probably something about how the dead don't rest until they're found. Rebecca's remains were buried in the Port Haven cemetery on a cold January afternoon beneath a sky that threatened snow but never delivered. The grave was next to her mother and father, a plot that had been waiting empty for 46 years, as if Claire had always known on some level that her daughter would come home eventually. The headstone was simple grey granite with letters carved deep enough to last another century. Rebecca Ann Moreau, 1956-1979. Found, remembered, home. About 50 people attended the burial. Some had known Rebecca, elderly neighbors, former classmates, people who remembered the girl with the camera and the anchor necklace. Others hadn't known her at all, but came because it felt important to witness, to acknowledge, to say that this life had mattered. Danny Carlisle was there, still carrying the necklace in his pocket. He'd meant to give it to someone, the sheriff, the minister, someone who'd know what to do with it. But when the moment came, he couldn't let it go. He kept it, and he keeps it still, in a small wooden box on his dresser next to the picture of his father and grandfather, standing on the deck of the boat that Danny now captains. Outside the cemetery, the wind came off the ocean, carrying the smell of salt and pine and winter. The lighthouse, visible from the graveyard, blinked its steady rhythm against the afternoon gloom. The harbour was quiet, the boats tied securely to the docks, the water grey and restless under the January sky. Gulls circled overhead, their cries sharp and lonely. The tide was coming in as it always did, indifferent to human grief and human justice, indifferent to the decades that had passed and the lives that had been shattered. Port Haven would go on. It always had. Towns like this don't disappear just because terrible things happen in them. They absorb the trauma, internalize it, carry it forward. The people who remain learn to live with ghosts, but something had shifted in Port Haven, something fundamental and irreversible. The town had looked into the mirror and seen the face of its complicity, not in the murder itself, but in the ease with which they'd accepted a comfortable lie. Rebecca drowned. Rebecca ran away. Rebecca was gone, and there was nothing to be done about it. They'd believed Hank Morrison because it was easier than suspecting him, because suspicion would have required them to question everything they thought they knew about their town, their neighbors, themselves. They'd moved on because staying still was unbearable, because grief without resolution is a wound that never heals, and in doing so, they'd allowed a killer to live freely among them for nearly half a century, to coach their children, and attend their churches and wave from his porch and pretend to be human. There are other cases like this, hidden in small towns across America, in harbor offices and church basements and fishing boats, in places where everyone knows everyone, and no one knows anything at all. Cases that went cold, not because the evidence didn't exist, but because the technology wasn't there yet, because the right person didn't ask the right question, because someone who should have been suspected was trusted instead. They wait in storage rooms and file cabinets, in cardboard boxes labeled with years and names that nobody remembers anymore. They wait for forensic science to catch up, for databases to expand, for a fisherman to pull up a necklace or a hiker to find bones, or a demolition crew to discover something hidden in the walls of an old building. They wait for someone to care enough to look again, to refuse the comfortable lie, to insist that the dead deserve answers even if it takes decades. 46 years is a long time to wait for justice. It's most of a human lifetime. It's long enough for children to grow old, for technology to transform, for entire ways of life to disappear. The Port Haven that Rebecca Moreau walked through in 1979 no longer exists except in memory and old photographs. The cannery is gone. The lobster shack is something else now. The docks have been rebuilt. The people who knew her are mostly dead or scattered. The town has been renovated, rebranded, turned into something that tourists from Boston find charming and authentic. But the ocean doesn't change. The water that holds secrets in 1979 holds them still in 2025. The currents that carried Rebecca's body to its resting place are the same currents that move past Danny Carlisle's boat every morning. The truth doesn't dissolve in salt water. It doesn't decay. It waits, patient and implacable, for the moment when it can surface. And sometimes, against all odds, it does. A net catches something unexpected. A necklace glints in the beam of a headlamp. DNA that's been waiting in the dark for 46 years finally finds its match. The phone rings at 4:47 in the morning, and everything changes. Not because justice has been served. Justice delayed this long is barely justice at all. Claire Moreau died without answers. Sheriff Carver died carrying the weight of failure. Rebecca herself was denied a future, denied the chance to become whoever she would have been. Nothing can restore what was taken, but something has been acknowledged. Something has been named. The lie that Port Haven lived with for 46 years has been exposed, and the town will never be quite the same. There's a photograph that hangs in the Port Haven Public Library now, in the local history section, alongside pictures of fishing boats and town meetings, and the lighthouse before it was automated. It shows Rebecca Moreau at 23, sitting on the bench outside the general store, camera in her lap, smiling at whoever's taking the picture. The anchor necklace is visible at her throat. Beneath the photograph, a small plaque reads, Rebecca Ann Moreau, 1956-1979. Journalist, photographer, daughter of Port Haven. Her life was taken, but her story was not forgotten. Found November 10th, 2025. People stop to look at it sometimes. Tourists mostly, who've heard about the case, who've read the articles or watched the documentary that aired on Dateline. They take pictures of the photograph with their phones. They ask the librarian what happened, and the librarian, a woman in her 60s who's lived in Port Haven her entire life, tells them, not because the story is entertaining, but because forgetting would be worse. The ocean keeps its secrets only until it doesn't. DNA doesn't lie, the truth doesn't dissolve, and sometimes after decades of silence, a silver necklace rises from the depths and brings the whole terrible story with it. Port Haven learned this lesson the hardest way possible, by discovering that the man they'd trusted had been a killer all along, that their instincts had failed them, that their comfortable assumptions about small-town safety were built on sand. They learned that you can't really know anyone, not completely, not even the people you've lived beside for 50 years. They learned that evil doesn't announce itself with horns and red eyes. It wears a friendly face. It waves from the dock office window. It helps with the search parties. It sleeps soundly at night while mothers grieve and sheriffs chase ghosts, and the body of a 23-year-old girl lies chained to the ocean floor. Where were you when the anchor finally surfaced? When the story you thought you knew turned out to be the story you'd been avoiding all along? When the comfortable lie shattered and the ugly truth took its place? These questions don't have easy answers. They're not meant to. They're meant to make you uncomfortable, to make you question, to make you understand that justice delayed is not the same as justice denied, but it's not the same as justice served either. It's something else, something harder, something that carries the weight of all the years that passed while the truth stayed hidden. Claire Moreau died waiting. Sheriff Carver died failing. Rebecca Moreau died at 23 with a camera and a future and a mother who loved her. And Hank Morrison, who took all of that away with a wrench and a chain and 46 years of lies, will die in prison, which is something, but not enough. It's never enough. These cases still wait in file cabinets and storage rooms, in the memories of mothers who never stopped hoping, in the silence of communities that chose comfort over truth. They wait for advances in forensic science, for someone to care enough to look again, for the right piece of evidence to surface at the right time. They wait for fishermen and hikers and construction workers and anyone else who might stumble across what was hidden. They wait for the moment when the past and the present collide, when the ocean gives back what it took, when the truth rises from the depths. Rebecca Moreau waited 46 years. How many others are still waiting? How many silver necklaces are still out there, tangled in nets or buried in walls or sunk in lakes or scattered in forests, holding the stories of lives interrupted and questions unanswered? Subscribe so that none of them stay hidden, so that every Rebecca Moreau finds her way home, even if it takes decades, even if everyone who loved her is already gone, so that the comfortable lies get shattered and the ugly truths get spoken, so that small towns have to face what they've been avoiding, and the men who smile and wave and pretend to be pillars of the community get recognized for what they really are. Justice delayed is bitter. Justice denied is worse. But justice that finally, against all odds, arrives, even 46 years late, even when it can't undo the damage, even when it can only name what happened and punish who did it, is still justice. And that still matters. It has to matter. Because if it doesn't, if we decide that time erases culpability, that enough years can make murder acceptable, then we've lost something more essential than we can afford to lose. We've lost the insistence that the dead deserve answers, that the truth deserves to be spoken, that evil doesn't get to hide in plain sight forever. The ocean kept Rebecca Moreau's secret for 46 years, but the ocean couldn't keep it forever. Nothing can.